Her parents sold her because of her size. She was 15 years old, and her life was traded for 2 jugs of corn whiskey, a sack of flour, and $3. She never expected kindness from this world. She certainly never expected love. But one man, a stranger with quiet eyes and a steady hand, saw something beyond her shame. And what he did next wouldn't just save her. It would change her entire world. The girl was standing barefoot in the dirt of the holding pen. Her shoulders were hunched forward, her hands clutched at her sides so tightly her knuckles were white. She was trying to disappear inside herself, to shrink until she was nothing but a memory. The hem of her plain calico dress was too short, revealing dust-caked ankles. Her face, which was naturally round and soft, was lowered to the ground, a curtain of matted brown hair hiding it from view. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears days ago. She didn't speak. Her voice had been stolen by fear, and even as the traitor who'd bought her from her father shouted her name like it was a curse, she didn't flinch. Not anymore. The flinching was a luxury she couldn't afford. It showed you could still feel something, and feeling anything was dangerous here. "Clara May!" the man yelled, his voice thick with cheap liquor and impatience. "I said get up straight! Ain't no man gonna want you if you look like a hanged possum." She straightened, but only barely. A fraction of an inch. His name felt wrong in that man's mouth. It wasn't his to use. He was just the one who'd counted the coins into her father's grimy hand, the one who'd finalized the transaction that turned her from a daughter into livestock. She'd heard the whole thing from inside the lean-to, where she was told to wait. "Ain't got no use for a girl eats that much," her father had grumbled, his voice cracking with a miserable blend of meanness and shame. "Always been too soft, that one. Never did fit right in our life." So here she stood, 15 years old and already sold, like a calf too plump for real work, but not nearly good enough for show. The other girls in the pen, younger and thinner and more afraid, had shuffled away from her. They kept their distance like her size. Her shame might be catching. Nobody wanted the fat girl. Not for scrubbing floors, not for mending clothes, not even for the things men did in the dark. Until he arrived. It was near the end of the day. The sun had dropped low in the sky, a bleeding orange orb that threw long golden shadows over the ramshackle barn and the crooked fence posts. The meager crowd had thinned. A few rough-looking men leaned against wagon sides, watching with half-interested predatory eyes as the trader hollered about a discount. "Last one of the day, boys. A bargain for the big one. Strong back, I guarantee it." A horse stomped nearby. A dog barked once and was silenced with a kick. The world felt tired and cruel and final. Then he rode in. Dust kicked up from the hooves of the Palomino stallion he rode, but the man himself was as quiet as a shadow. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a dark coat despite the heat. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his eyes, and those eyes scanned the pen with a look so still, so unreadable, it made Clara's stomach twist into a cold knot. He wasn't like the others. The others leered. They appraised. They looked at the girls like they were slabs of meat. This man, he just looked. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with a firm, solid sound that silenced the trader mid-sentence. The entire holding pen seemed to go quiet, holding its breath. "Looking for help, mister?" The trader tried, his voice shifting, becoming oily and fast. "Got a fine selection today. Real hardy girls, most of them, young and eager to please." The stranger didn't answer at first. He just walked toward the fence, his gaze moving past the other girls, past the trader, until it landed directly on Clara May. She dropped her gaze to the dirt again, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked pounding against her ribs. She could feel his eyes on her. She knew what he was seeing, not the kind of girl anyone ever picked first, or at all. She was thick through the arms and hips, her chest too full for her age, and her face carried the roundness of someone who'd always been told to eat less, smile more, and never, ever speak unless asked. "You," the the man said finally. His voice was calm, so calm it cut clean through the evening hum of flies and shifting hooves. It wasn't loud, but it carried. What's her name? The trader blinked, momentarily thrown. Her? That's Clara May, but listen, mister. I got younger ones if that's what you're looking for. Sprier ones. She's a good worker, don't get me wrong, but well, let's just say she takes up more room than most. Clara flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement. She hated herself for it. The stranger's eyes didn't leave her. I wasn't asking your opinion, he said, his voice still perfectly level. I asked her name. The trader hesitated, his greasy smile tightening. Clara May, he repeated. The man stepped closer to the fence. He smelled faintly of saddle leather, pine soap, and the open air. Clara could feel the intensity of his gaze on the top of her head, though she hadn't dared to look up. Clara May, he said again, softer this time. Is that right? She managed a single nod, her eyes still fixed on the cracked earth. Her hands were shaking now, a tremor she couldn't control. You got any say in where you go? He asked, his voice low enough that only she and the trader could hear. She shook her head. No, of course not. She was property. He looked back at the trader, his expression unreadable. What's the price? The trader's face lit up, sensing an easy sale. Tell you what, for you, take her off my hands, and I'll throw in a second apron for free. She ain't trouble, just eats more than she ought. Say $2? The stranger reached into his coat. He pulled out a worn leather pouch, and without a word, he counted out the coins. Slow, deliberate. He placed them into the trader's grubby palm with a weight that seemed to silence the man for good. Then he turned back to Clara, and he offered her his hand. She stared at it. A large, calloused hand held out through the fence rails. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. No one had offered her anything in years. Not a kind word, not a portion of food without a sneer, and certainly not a choice. I'm Samuel Wyatt, the man said quietly. I own a ranch south of Carter Ridge. It's not fancy, but it's clean. You'll have your own bed, a safe place to sleep. Nobody will touch you without your say, and you'll eat 3 meals a day, no rationing. Clara blinked, the dust in her eyes mixing with a sudden shocking wetness. He didn't pull his hand back. You come with me if you want, he said. Or not. I won't drag you. That was the part that undid her. Not the offer of food, not even the strange, unexpected kindness in his voice. It was the choice. He wasn't grabbing her. He wasn't calling her names or shoving her toward a wagon like a sack of grain. He was just standing there, with his hand held out like she was someone worth asking, like she was a person. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for it. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against his. She flinched out of habit when their skin touched, but his grip was steady, warm, strong. He opened the gate and led her out. He helped her up onto his horse without a single grunt of effort, then swung into the saddle behind her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She braced for the laughter from the other men, for the trader's parting jab about the horse's strained back. But none came. There was just the creak of saddle leather and the soft, rhythmic sound of hooves as Samuel Wyatt turned his horse and began the long ride south, away from the pen and the shame and the life that had tried to crush her. They rode in silence for a long time. The town fell away behind them, replaced by rolling fields and the deepening shadows of dusk. Clara sat stiffly, her back ramrod straight, not daring to lean against the man behind her. She was acutely aware of his body, the warmth of his chest, the solidness of his arms on either side of her. It was terrifying, and in a way she couldn't understand, comforting. Finally, her voice barely a whisper, she asked the question that was screaming in her mind. Why me? He didn't answer right away. The horse plodded on, its pace steady. The sky turned from orange to a deep, bruised purple. When he finally did speak, his voice was just as steady as his hand had been. Because I've seen enough people in this world tear each other down, he said. You looked like you needed someone to do the opposite. She didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever said anything like that to her. She didn't have the words. He didn't push. They made it to the edge of town before the sun fully dipped below the horizon. She thought he might stop at one of the inns or hitching posts, but instead, he veered toward a little clearing under a grove of cottonwood trees and set up a small campfire. He handed her a thick wool blanket without comment, then heated up beans and cornbread from a cloth-wrapped bundle in his saddlebag. He passed her a full portion on a tin plate. Eat what you want, he said, sitting across the fire from her. Ain't no one here counting bites. Her eyes welled up, fast and unexpected. She ducked her head, trying to hide it, shoveling the food into her mouth so she wouldn't have to speak. He didn't mention it. He just stared into the flames, giving her the space to eat, to breathe. Hours later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, she finally spoke again. Her voice was a hoarse whisper across the dying coals. My ma said I'd never find anyone willing to take me on. Samuel tossed another small log onto the fire. Sparks danced up into the darkness. He stared into the glow for a long moment. Well, he said slowly, his voice resonating in the quiet night. She was wrong. Clara May didn't sleep much that night, curled in the blanket a safe distance from the fire. But for the first time and as long as she could remember, she didn't cry either. She lay awake, listening to the crickets and the soft sigh of the wind, and she knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, it was hers to choose now. And that single, terrifying, beautiful thought changed everything. But as she stared into the darkness, a different feeling began to creep in, a cold sliver of doubt. This kindness felt too good to be true. Men weren't like this, not the men she knew. What did he really want? Everyone wanted something. Her father wanted whiskey. The trader wanted coin. What did Samuel Wyatt want from her? The question hung in the night air, unanswered and heavy with dread. The second morning came gray and soft, with a thick fog curling through the cottonwoods. Dew beaded on every blade of grass like tiny glass jewels. Clara sat wrapped in the blanket Samuel had given her, staring into the embers of the fire. She hadn't known it was possible to feel this kind of quiet. Not just the silence around her, but a stillness deep inside. It was a strange, new feeling. Not warm yet, but no longer freezing cold. A middle place, a place of waiting. Samuel moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done every chore 1,000 times. He had the coffee pot on before she even noticed him gathering fresh kindling. His movements were spare and precise, no wasted energy. When she finally stood up, feeling awkward and unsure of what to do, he simply handed her a tin mug of hot black coffee and nodded toward the fire. You don't owe me work, Clara, he said, his voice a low rumble in the misty morning. Not today. But I want to, she said quickly, clutching the mug with both hands for its warmth. I want to earn my keep. He didn't argue. He just gave her another one of his long, unreadable looks, and then nodded once. We've got a long ride ahead. Can you sit the horse all day? She hesitated for a split second, the truth on the tip of her tongue, that every muscle in her body already ached from yesterday's ride, but she pushed it down. She wouldn't be a burden. Yes, sir, she said. He gave her a look that was almost a frown. You don't need to sir me either. Samuel works just fine. She bit the inside of her cheek. No one had ever corrected her like that before, like he actually cared what she called him, not just how obedient she sounded. It was another small, unsettling kindness that she didn't know how to process. They packed up their small camp in near silence. She expected him to start barking instructions, to treat her like the servant she now was, assuming the initial kindness had been spent. But he didn't. He handed her his own old canteen, filled to the brim, without comment. He waited for her to mount the big palomino before climbing up behind her. The ride south was rougher than the first leg. The roads became less traveled, broken by gnarled tree roots and shallow river bends. Clara was sore within the first hour, her thighs and back screaming in protest. But she didn't complain. She wouldn't. Not after what he'd done for her. She gritted her teeth and focused on the steady rhythm of the horse's gait. Still, Samuel noticed. Of course he did. He seemed to notice everything. "We'll break early today," he said around noon, his voice close to her ear. "Give the horse a rest. And you." She didn't argue this time, just nodded, a wave of relief washing over her that was so potent it made her feel weak. The rest stop was beside a shallow, gurgling stream. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth, mossy stones. Clara slid off the horse, her legs trembling, and stumbled toward the water. She hiked up the hem of her worn dress and dipped her bare feet in. The shock of the cold was breathtaking, wonderful. It washed away some of the ache, some of the dust, some of the fear. She didn't even realize she was smiling until Samuel glanced over from where he was watering the horse. "That's the first time I've seen you look peaceful," he said. Her smile vanished instantly. She looked away, flustered, heat rising in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to stop working." He walked over and sat on a large, flat rock near the stream bank. "You don't have to apologize for joy, Clara." That simple sentence lodged itself deep in her chest, a strange and painful seed. She wanted to ask him how he knew to say things like that, how he knew exactly which parts of her were most afraid and broken, but the words tangled up in her throat, thick with a lifetime of unshed tears. After a simple lunch of dried meat and hardtack, he asked a question that startled her. "Ever used a rifle?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. "You'll need to learn," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "There's coyotes and snakes out where I live, and men worse than either." Something about the way he said that sent a cold chill through her, chasing away the afternoon warmth. It wasn't a threat, never that, but it was a heavy warning. "Are there other people on your land?" she asked hesitantly. "No," he said. "Not anymore." The pause that followed was thick with things unsaid. She waited, her heart thumping for him to explain. He didn't. He just stood up, his face a mask, and started packing their things. They reached the first rise of the Carter Ridge Hills by evening. The land grew quieter out here, wilder. There were no signs of townsfolk or wagons, just an endless expanse of open sky, rolling grasslands, and the constant whisper of the wind. The horse seemed to know the way, its steps sure and steady, leading without any command from Samuel. Clara found herself leaning back against him, just slightly. It wasn't because she was tired, though she was exhausted to her bones. It was because she wanted to trust him. She desperately wanted to believe this was real. And somehow, her weary body believed before her mind could catch up. When the ranch finally appeared on the horizon, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't large or grand. A weathered but sturdy-looking house sat nestled in a gentle, protected valley. A small barn stood behind it, and a well-kept corral was off to the side. A single lazy curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a sign of life, of home. A few chickens pecked contentedly near the porch. There was a stillness to the whole place, a sense of deep, abiding peace that felt almost sacred. "This is yours?" she whispered, unable to comprehend it. He nodded, a hint of something she couldn't name, pride, sorrow, in his expression. All of it. She couldn't imagine it. Owning land, being safe on it, having chickens that weren't liable to be stolen or lost, a house with a roof that didn't leak. She tried to picture herself inside it, a part of it, and her mind went blank. It was like trying to imagine living on the moon. "You'll have your own room," he said as they dismounted near the porch. "I ain't expecting anything else." Clara swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "But I'll work for it. I can clean. I can cook. I'm strong." "Not today," he said firmly. "Today, you rest." Inside, the house was plain but meticulously neat. A well-worn Bible sat open on the mantel. A pair of muddy boots stood by the door. A rifle was mounted on the wall above the fireplace, and a worn coat hung neatly on a peg. It was a man's space, quiet and solitary. He led her to a small room at the back of the house. It had a narrow bed with a simple wooden frame, a window that faced east toward the rising sun, and a colorful quilt that looked lovingly handmade. "No one slept in here in a long time," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "But it's yours now." She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in, trying desperately not to cry. "It's beautiful." He nodded once, then left her to settle in, closing the door gently behind him. Dinner was quiet. He made a rich stew from a pot that had clearly been simmering for a while. He must have prepared it before he even left for town, expecting to bring someone back. The thought was both comforting and confusing. He didn't press her to talk, just served her a full bowl and asked if she liked carrots. When she timidly said yes, he gave her more. The silence between them wasn't awkward or tense. It was the kind that didn't press. It let her breathe. But that night, Clara couldn't sleep. Her body, so long accustomed to fear, refused to rest. Every creak of the floorboards, every thump of the wind against the shutters made her flinch. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to end, for the real price to be named. Finally, she crept from the bed and padded to the window. Moonlight spilled in, a river of silver over the silent, rolling hills. The world outside was peaceful, empty. And then something moved. Out by the barn. She stiffened, her blood turning to ice. There it was again. Just a shadow, a flicker of movement, slipping between the posts of the corral fence. A coyote? A man. Clara's mind screamed. No, it couldn't be. Not here. This was supposed to be safe. She grabbed the oil lamp from the small bedside table, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She crept into the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Samuel was already there. He stood in the center of the main room, rifle in hand, his shirt half-buttoned, his eyes as sharp as blades of glass. He didn't look surprised to see her awake. He looked like he'd been waiting. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "What is it?" she breathed. He didn't answer. He was already moving toward the door. She ignored his command and followed anyway, out onto the porch, past the sleeping chickens, toward the dark, looming shape of the barn. He moved like a man who had done this many times before. No wasted motion, no noise. A predator in his own right. He signaled for her to stop at the edge of the porch light. Then he opened the barn door, fast and silent. Inside, there was nothing. Just the sweet smell of hay, the glint of tools on the wall, and the sound of the palomino sleeping softly in its stall. But then Clara saw it, and her stomach dropped. The small back window of the barn was wide open, and in the soft dirt just beneath it was a single clear boot print. Someone had been here, watching the house. Samuel cursed under his breath. It wasn't a loud curse, not the kind that broke God's name, just a grim, angry mutter. "I'll fix that window tomorrow," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You go on in." "But who?" she started. "I'll keep watch," he interrupted, his eyes scanning the dark tree line. "Nothing's getting through tonight." She should have gone back to bed. She should have trusted him and hidden in her new room, but her legs wouldn't move. A new, more specific fear was taking root. "Was it a man from the town?" she whispered. He didn't lie to her. He didn't try to soften it. He just looked at her, his face grim in the moonlight. "Yes," he said. "I think he knew me." The way he said it chilled her more than the night wind ever could. He knew me. Not he knew you. This wasn't random. This wasn't about her past catching up to her. This was about his, and she had just walked right into the middle of it. Back inside, she sat on the edge of her bed, her arms wrapped tight around herself. She'd been sold, shamed, and dragged across counties, but somehow, this moment, knowing that someone out there might come in the night, not for her, but for the man who had saved her, frightened her more than anything else had. She saw his silhouette once or twice through her window, a dark shape sitting on the porch steps, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness. He didn't sleep, and nothing else came. By morning, the fear hadn't gone away, but it was smaller. It was manageable, because someone had stayed awake for her. Someone had chosen to protect her, not harm her. When she stepped into the kitchen, smelling coffee, he was already at the stove, making eggs. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. "I think you should start carrying a knife," he said, sliding a plate toward her without looking at her. She stared at him, startled. "I ain't saying you'll need it," he added, finally meeting her gaze. "I'm just saying I'd rather you have it and not need it than need it and not have it." She took the plate with shaking hands. "I've never held one for fighting." He nodded. "Then we'll start with that." As she sat down to eat the first real breakfast she'd had in years, Clara realized something profound and terrifying. A man could give you food without wanting your body. A man could stand guard without asking for anything in return. A man could teach you to fight, not to control you, but to free you. And maybe, just maybe, a man like that could be trusted, even when the past tried to claw its way back in. Especially then. Because Samuel Wyatt wasn't just protecting her from his own demons, he was teaching her how to protect herself from them too. And whoever had crept up to that barn, whoever had left that single menacing boot print in the dirt, they weren't finished. That shadow would return. But this time, she wouldn't be the same helpless girl waiting in the dark. This time, she'd be ready. 3 days passed. An uneasy, watchful quiet settled over the ranch. Clara swept the floors, washed the dishes, and helped tend to the animals with hands that grew steadier each day. But her eyes still drifted to the windows more often than they should have. She kept telling herself she was imagining things, that the boot print was from a random traveler, that Samuel had scared the trespasser off for good. But the weight of that night sat in her stomach like a cold, hard stone. She hadn't imagined the open window. She hadn't imagined the look on Samuel's face. He didn't speak of it again, but he didn't ignore it either. He worked from sunup to sundown, his usual tireless routine, but now his rifle was never more than an arm's length away. The back window of the barn was boarded up, hammered tight with new nails. He'd added a heavy new slide lock to the barn door. Clara saw him checking the perimeter every single evening, his tall frame a silhouette against the setting sun, as he scanned the tree line with that quiet, controlled tension he wore like a second skin. One morning, while Samuel was mending a fence post near the west field, Clara brought him a dipper of cool water from the well. She saw him wince as he crouched down to take it. "You're hurt," she said. It wasn't a question. He stood up slowly, his hand pressed almost unconsciously to his ribs. "Old break," he said, his voice a little tight. "Rain brings it back." She set the water bucket down on a rock. "From the war?" He paused, his eyes looking out over the hills, seeing something far away. Then he nodded once. "And a bad fall breaking a horse afterwards. Didn't set right." Clara wanted to ask more. She wanted to know about his past, about the war, about the not anymore, when she'd asked if other people lived here. But she didn't. The questions felt too heavy, too intrusive. Instead, she looked across the golden hills and asked something else, something that had been burning inside her since that first night. "Why'd you really take me in, Samuel?" He didn't answer right away. He took a long drink of water, his throat working. Then he looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "I was raised to believe you don't walk away from someone God puts in your path, especially not when they're hurting." She nodded, a familiar lump forming in her throat. "Most folks don't think that way." "Most folks forget the part where it says do unto others," he said simply. She stared at the ground, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of her worn shoe. "I ain't ever been treated like someone who mattered." "You do now," he said. 3 words, that's all it took. 3 simple words that held her together for the rest of that day, a shield against the creeping fear. That afternoon, he took her out to the shooting post he'd built behind the barn. It was a simple setup, a few hay bales stacked up with old dented cans lined up on top. He handed her the heavy rifle. "Start with the stance," he instructed, his voice patient. "Feet shoulder-width apart, elbows firm, breathe in, then squeeze the trigger easy. Don't yank it." She was nervous. The rifle felt alien and heavy in her arms, a tool of violence. Her first shot missed by a foot, kicking back hard against her shoulder. She flinched, blinking hard as the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Samuel didn't mock her. He just said, "Again." By the fifth shot, she nicked the edge of a can. By the eighth, it tipped over with a satisfying plink. She turned to him, her eyes wide with startled pride. "I hit it." He nodded, a small, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Told you. You just had to stop shaking." She smiled back, a real smile this time, bright and honest and wide. "Can I try again?" He let out a short, soft chuckle. "That's the idea." They stayed out there until the sky turned purple and the cans were too hard to see. That night, Clara slept better than she had in months. She slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the truly exhausted, her body aching from work, not fear. A week passed, then two. A new rhythm began to form, a rhythm of work and quiet companionship. Clara started waking before sunrise, beating Samuel to the stove. She learned how he liked his coffee, black and strong enough to dissolve a spoon. She started breakfast while he dressed for chores. The rhythm of the place was beginning to soak into her skin like warmth from the sun. The steady routine, the clean smell of animals and pine woods, the good ache of tired muscles at the end of the day. That ache meant she'd done something real, something good. She didn't flinch as much when he walked into a room. She didn't brace herself when his hand passed near her shoulder as he reached for something. And sometimes, when he laughed, which was still a rare and precious sound, she found herself laughing too. One evening, after a long day of clearing brush from a new pasture, Samuel sat across from her at the small kitchen table and said, "I've got to ride into town tomorrow, for supplies." Clara nodded, her stomach giving a little lurch. "I'd prefer not to leave the place empty," he continued, watching her reaction. "Reckon you'd feel all right coming with me?" She tensed. Town, crowds, eyes, whispers. "Will they recognize me?" she asked, her voice small. "Doubt it," he said. "You look different now." She did. She knew she did. Her cheeks, once pale and puffy from malnourishment and stress, had color again. The simple dresses he'd bought for her from a mail-order catalog actually fit, cinching at a waist she was discovering she had. She held herself straighter. She wasn't the same hunched, broken girl from the holding pen. Still, the idea of walking past a crowd of strangers made her heart squeeze with old fear. "I'll stay close," he added, seeming to read her mind. "You won't be alone for a second." She met his steady eyes. He wasn't asking. He was offering a choice, as always. "Then I'll go," she said. The town of Dry Gulch hadn't changed in the month since she'd last seen it. It had the same dusty main street, the same false-fronted buildings, the same saloon with broken shutters. The same dry wind carried the familiar smell of horses, dust, and pipe smoke. But to Clara, it looked entirely different. Because this time, she rode in on the front seat of a sturdy wagon, sitting beside a man who had never once raised his hand or his voice to her. She wore one of the new dresses he'd bought for her, a pale blue one with a simple white collar. She'd sewn the hem up herself, the stitches small and neat. Her hair was braided and clean. Her hands were folded in her lap. She felt almost like a normal person. Still, as they passed the blacksmith's forge and the general store, she saw heads turn. She saw one woman lean into another and whisper behind a gloved hand. She felt the eyes on her, and the old shame came rushing back. She instinctively ducked her head. Samuel noticed. Of course he did. "Ignore them," he said, his voice low and firm. "Do they know?" she whispered. "Doesn't matter if they do. he replied. They stopped first at the feed and grain store. Samuel went inside, leaving her to wait on the wagon. She tried to keep her eyes forward, fixed on the horse's back, but they drifted. A young boy ran past, chasing a stray dog, his laughter echoing down the street. Two old men sat on a bench outside the saloon, their hats tilted low, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. A woman in a dark dress swept dust off her porch and paused, broom in hand, to stare directly at Clara. Then a voice said her name, not softly, not kindly. Clara May. Her breath caught, her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was a voice from her nightmares. She turned her head slowly, mechanically, and there, standing just across the street, leaning against a support post for the hotel awning, was her father. She hadn't seen him since the day he'd signed the paper, since the day he'd watched the trader lead her away without a backward glance. Her heart leaped into her throat, choking her. He looked thinner, somehow meaner. His clothes were more ragged, but his eyes hadn't changed. They were still hard and sharp and full of a bitter resentment that she had never understood. "Well, well," he said, pushing himself off the post and stepping off the boardwalk into the street. "Ain't you cleaned up nice?" She froze. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The door to the feed store opened. Samuel stepped out, carrying a sack of oats over his shoulder. He saw her face, saw the direction of her terrified gaze, and he went utterly still. The easy way he carried the heavy sack was gone. He lowered it to the ground slowly, every muscle in his body tense. The air between the three of them crackled like fire on dry wood. Her father sneered, his eyes flicking from her to Samuel. "You must be the one who took her. Bet you think you're some kind of hero." Samuel didn't rise to the bait. He stepped around the front of the wagon deliberately, placing himself between her and her father, a solid, immovable wall. "Sir," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I suggest you walk away." "She's my blood," her father spat. "My daughter." Samuel's eyes didn't waver. "She's not your property." The man let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "Ain't no law says you can just take what's mine." "There's a law that says selling your own daughter is a crime," Samuel shot back, his voice like flint. Her father flinched at that, not from shame, from fear. Samuel took another slow step forward, closing the distance. "You touch her," he said, his voice a deadly promise. "You even come near her again, and I'll make sure the sheriff sees every paper you ever signed. I'll see you rot in a cell." Her father stared, his jaw clenching and unclenching. He looked from Samuel's cold, hard face to the gathering onlookers who were now openly staring. Then he spat in the dirt at Samuel's feet. "She was always too soft," he snarled, his eyes finding Clara's one last time. "Never worth the trouble." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the alley between the saloon and the hotel. Clara didn't realize she was shaking uncontrollably until Samuel's hand touched her arm. She gasped, a choked, broken sound. I thought he was gone." "He is," Samuel said gently, "but he saw me. He knows where—" "He can't touch you," Samuel said, his voice full of a certainty she couldn't feel. Her knees buckled. He caught her before she could fall, his strong arms holding her steady until she could breathe again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, burying her face in his rough shirt. "You didn't do anything wrong," he murmured into her hair. He helped her back onto the wagon seat. The rest of the shopping trip was a blur, short, silent, and tense. No more stops at the general store, just the sound of wheels turning fast over the dirt road leading out of town. Back at the ranch, Clara helped unload the supplies with tight, trembling hands. Every shadow looked like her father. Every gust of wind sounded like his voice. Samuel didn't press her to talk, but that night, as they sat by the fire, she had to ask, "Why didn't you hit him?" He looked up from the fire he was poking with a stick. "Wouldn't have changed anything." "I wanted you to." she admitted in a small voice. I know. She stared into the flames, watching them dance. What if he comes back? Then we'll be ready. There was something in the way he said we that filled her chest with a confusing mixture of warmth and dread. She had never been part of a we before, and now that she was terrified of losing it. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stood at her window for hours, watching the dark tree line, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Just before the first light of dawn, she saw it. A flicker of movement. A figure slipping through the brush at the far edge of the pasture. Just far enough away to stay in the shadows, but it was there. It wasn't her father's shape. It was taller, broader. It was the shadow from the barn. She didn't scream. She didn't wake Samuel. She went to the corner of the main room, took down the spare rifle from the wall mount, checked the chamber just as he'd taught her, and sat in the chair by the front door. And she waited, for whatever came next. She was no longer just the protected. She was a protector. And that changed everything, all over again. She stayed in that chair by the front door until the sun finally crept over the eastern hills, spilling pale gold light into the room. The heavy rifle sat steady across her lap. Her hands were clammy, but her breathing never shook. Clara had never stood guard over anything in her life, not even herself. But this ranch, this quiet man who treated her like she had worth, this fragile new life that was slowly starting to feel like more than just borrowed time. It was hers to defend now, and she'd sit awake every single night if she had to. When Samuel stepped out of his room, already buttoning his work shirt, he stopped short when he saw her. He took in the rifle, her pale face, the determined set of her jaw. You sleep at all? He asked, his voice low and rough. She just shook her head. No. His eyes moved from her face to the front window, then back to her. He didn't have to ask. She nodded before he could. I saw someone, same spot as before, stayed in the shadows. He walked over without a word and moved the thin curtain aside, peering out. The field beyond was still and bright now, heavy with morning dew. Empty. But tracks didn't wait for broad daylight. Come with me, he said. She followed him outside, her bare feet cold on the wooden porch. The earth was damp and cool beneath her toes, but she didn't care. They circled the house first, then the barn, their eyes scanning the ground. Near the far edge of the fence line, right where the trees began their thick, dark march up the hill, they found them. Fresh boot prints, heavy, deep. Not her father's worn-out soles. These were different. They ran parallel to the brush, never breaking the cover of the tree line. Whoever it was had been patrolling, watching. Samuel's jaw tensed. He straightened up slowly, his eyes fixed on the forest. They're getting bold. Should we go to the sheriff? She asked, her voice a little shaky now that the sun was up, and the immediate danger had passed. Not yet. Why not? He finally looked at her, his expression grim but kind. Because I need to be sure first. If this is who I think it is, it's not someone the law will help us with. Clara felt her stomach turn into a cold, hard knot. The way he said it. The personal darkness in his tone. You don't think it's him? My father? Samuel didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. The silence was his answer. It was more complicated than that. It was worse. Instead of talking, he spent the rest of the morning working. He wasn't mending fences or clearing brush. He was stringing a thin, almost invisible tripwire between the outer posts of the fence, attached to a series of small, rusted bells he'd found in the barn. I won't shoot a man unless I have to, he told her, as she helped him twist the wire tight. But I will protect what's mine. She didn't know whether to cry or smile at that. So she did both, quietly, turning her head so he wouldn't see. What's mine? He was talking about the ranch, but it felt like he meant her, too. That evening, The tension in the small house was thick enough to taste. After a silent dinner, Samuel placed the pistol he kept in a bedside drawer on the kitchen table. He didn't slam it down like a threat. He placed it gently, like a tool that demanded respect. "Time for lesson 2, he said. He showed her how to load it, how to check the chamber, how to release the safety. He placed it in her hand, wrapping his own large, warm hand over hers to guide her grip. "You aim small," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You breathe steady. You don't shoot unless it's to stop something coming at you." He paused, his eyes serious. "And if anything ever happens to me," he added, "you take the wagon and you go to Mrs. Adley's place down in Dawson. Tell her I sent you. She's a good woman. She'll help you." "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said, her voice fierce. He didn't argue, but he didn't promise either, and somehow that brutal honesty was more comforting than any lie would have been. The next 2 days passed in a haze of suffocating tension. Every creak of the floorboards made Clara flinch. Every distant hoofbeat or sudden gust of wind sent her rushing to the window. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew deep in her bones that someone was coming. Not for money, not for forgiveness, but for control, for revenge. Then, on the third night, it happened. Ting, ting-a-ling. The bell. Faint, but sharp and clear in the dead of night. Clara sat bolt upright in bed, her heart instantly pounding in her throat. She heard Samuel's footsteps in the hall, fast, but silent. She reached for the pistol he'd given her, which she'd kept under her pillow. Her hands found the cold metal without fumbling. By the time he pushed her door open, she was already standing, her thin nightgown clinging to her, hair loose down her back. "Front fence," he whispered, the rifle already in his hands. They moved as one, a silent, practiced team. Out the back door, staying low, creeping around the side of the house. The moon was nearly full, casting the field in a stark silver light. And there, standing just at the fence line where he'd found the prints, was a figure. Tall, broad, holding something in his hands. Samuel raised his rifle. "You take one more step," he called out, his voice ringing with authority in the still night, "and you'll answer for it." The figure paused. Then, slowly, it dropped the object it was holding. It thudded dully in the tall grass. Samuel stepped forward off the porch, rifle still raised, and Clara followed a few steps behind him, her own pistol held tight in both hands, aimed at the ground, but ready. As they approached, the man lifted his hands to show they were empty. "I ain't armed," he said. The voice was rough, nasal. It wasn't her father. "I don't want no trouble," the man said again, taking a hesitant step back. "Just delivering a message." He pointed to the bundle on the ground. Samuel nudged it with the toe of his boot, then kicked it over. It was a bundle of dirty cloth, wrapped around something round and heavy. He nudged the cloth open with his boot. Inside was a stone, a smooth gray river stone, and carved into the stone crudely were 4 letters, C-L-A-Y. Clara gasped, a sound of pure horror. Her brother's name, her dead baby brother. Samuel's voice was dangerously low, a growl. "What does this mean?" The messenger lowered his hands slowly. "Just a warning," he said, his eyes darting between Samuel and Clara. "He's looking for her." "Who sent you?" Samuel demanded. "Same one who always sends me," the man sneered. "The man who says she owes him." It wasn't her father. It was someone else. Someone she'd run from before. The man from Red Hill. The one who had bought her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Samuel's jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle jump. "You go back and you tell him—" "I ain't the kind that takes messages back," the man interrupted. Samuel raised the rifle just an inch, the barrel now level with the man's chest. "You are tonight." The man's eyes widened. He backed up slowly, his hands held high again. "You're gonna get her killed, mister," he hissed. "That girl's a burden, always was, a curse." That was the moment Clara stopped shaking. A hot, White rage burned through her fear. She stepped forward, past Samuel's protective arm, her eyes blazing. "You tell him I ain't afraid anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You tell him I ain't for sale." The man sneered. "Is that what this rancher told you to say?" "I said it for myself." The messenger didn't speak again. He just gave her one last, hateful look, then turned and melted back into the dark trees. When they couldn't hear his retreating footsteps anymore, Clara finally let out the breath she'd been holding, her legs suddenly feeling weak. Samuel knelt and picked up the stone. He held it in his palm, his expression dark. "You know what this is?" he asked softly. "Yes." "Explain it to me." She looked out over the silver field, her voice hollow. "Clay was my baby brother. He died of a fever the winter before my parents sold me. They never buried him proper, never got him a stone, said it was a waste of time and money." Her voice broke. "Said girls like me didn't get to mourn." Samuel stared down at the cruel, hand-carved stone. His face was a mask of cold fury. "So they dug up his grave?" he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "There was no grave to dig up," she said, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "They just left him. This is their way of saying they can find anything, that they can touch anything I ever cared about." He closed his hand around the stone, his knuckles white. He understood now. The sheer, calculated evil it took to do such a thing. This wasn't just a threat. It was a desecration. It was a promise of what they were willing to do to get her back. And it meant they were closer than ever. The very next day, they rode to Dawson. It was a hard, dangerous choice, leaving the ranch unprotected even for a few hours. But Samuel was resolute. "We need more than a tripwire and a rifle now," he'd said, his face grim. "We need eyes. We need allies." Mrs. Adley lived in a small, neat house just off the main road into town. She was a sharp-eyed widow in her 60s, with a voice that could calm a rabid dog and a well-oiled shotgun hanging above her mantel. She welcomed Samuel with a firm nod and, to Clara's complete surprise, pulled her into a brief, strong hug. "You'll always have a place here, child," she said, looking Clara right in the eye. "No matter what." Clara felt a lump form in her throat and fought back tears. Over strong, hot tea, Samuel explained everything that had happened. The man at the barn, the confrontation with her father, the menacing messenger, the desecrated stone. He didn't have to name the man from Red Hill, the one who thought he owned her. Mrs. Adley had known Clara's family for years. She knew exactly what kind of people they were, and she knew the rumors about the men they dealt with. "I can spread the word," she said, her lips a thin, determined line. "Folks in Dawson don't tolerate men like that, not when it comes to children. And if he so much as steps a foot past the ridge, I'll know about it." They left Dawson with a fragile sliver of peace in their hearts. But peace, Clara was learning, was a fleeting thing in her world. It didn't last the week. The attack came 2 nights later. It started with the horses. Clara heard their panicked whinnies first, a high, terrified sound that ripped through the night. It was followed by the sharp, splintering crack of something heavy hitting the fence. She bolted from her bed, grabbing the pistol as she ran. She met Samuel in the hall. He was already armed, his face a mask of stone. They burst out the front door and saw it. The barn was on fire. Flames, orange and yellow and hungry, licked at the dry roof. Thick black smoke poured out in choking waves, blotting out the stars. "The animals!" she screamed. Samuel didn't hesitate. He shoved the heavy barn doors open and ran straight into the inferno. Clara followed, tying a piece of her nightgown over her mouth and nose, coughing through the searing heat and blinding smoke. They got the palomino out first, slapping its flank to send it galloping into the far pasture. Then the 2 goats, bleeding in terror. The chickens were gone, a chaos of feathers and squawks scattering into the darkness. They worked frantically, pulling out saddles, tools, anything they could save, until the main roof beam groaned, cracked, and collapsed inward with a roar, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the night sky. The blaze lit up the entire yard like a malevolent dawn. And there, standing just beyond the tree line, they saw him. A tall, broad figure, bathed in the flickering firelight. He wasn't hiding this time. He just stood there, watching his handiwork, watching their sanctuary burn. Samuel didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot echoed across the valley. The man ducked and vanished back into the woods. Samuel cursed, a low, vicious sound. Then he turned to Clara, his face smudged with soot, his eyes burning with a desperate urgency. "Go pack," he ordered. "Now. We ain't staying here." "We can't just leave," she cried, looking at the ruin of their home. "We'll come back," he promised, grabbing her arm. "But tonight we run." She didn't argue. They threw what little they could into the wagon: rifles, ammunition, water, food, the blankets from their beds. They hitched the terrified horses with trembling hands, the smoke from the barn fire filling the sky behind them, casting long, dancing shadows across the hills. As they rode out, Clara turned and took one last look. The ranch she had just begun to love, the only safe place she had ever known, was being consumed by flames. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the man who wanted to destroy her hadn't even begun to fight. But she wasn't running scared this time. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was riding toward a battle, and she wouldn't ride alone. They rode hard through the night. The wagon jostled and slammed over unseen roots and rocks, and the horses, still spooked from the fire, breathed in ragged, panicked bursts with every pull. Samuel's knuckles were white where he gripped the reins. Clara sat beside him, the cold, heavy weight of the rifle laid across her lap, her eyes wide, scanning the darkness around them. Her heart thudded a frantic, exhausting rhythm against her ribs. Behind them, the pillar of smoke from their burning barn trailed against the moonlit sky like a long black ribbon of death. Everything they had started to build together, the peace, the routine, the fragile trust, was flickering away into ruin behind them. They didn't speak for miles. The only sounds were the thunder of the hooves, the creak of the wagon, and their own harsh breathing. When the dense trees finally opened up into wide, rolling pasture land, and the first hints of dawn streaked the eastern horizon with pale pink, Samuel finally slowed the exhausted team to a trot. Then he stopped. Clara looked around at the unfamiliar landscape. "Where are we?" "About 10 miles north of Dawson," he said, his voice hoarse. "Old trail I used to ride when I hauled cattle east. Ain't nobody finds this place unless they're trying real hard." He pulled the wagon off the barely there trail, guiding it into a thick grove of pine trees. The ground here was soft with years of fallen needles, and the air was still and cool and smelled sharply of pine. It felt like a secret corner of the world, forgotten by everyone. Clara climbed down stiffly from the wagon seat. Every muscle in her body ached with a deep, weary pain. Her dress was damp with sweat and smelled of smoke. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We rest," he said, his eyes scanning their back trail. "And we wait." "Wait for what?" Samuel looked back toward the trail, his face grim. "For that man to make his next mistake." They built a small, hidden camp deep within the trees. Samuel tied the horses to a thick pine, giving them water from a canvas bucket and feed from the small emergency stash he'd had the foresight to grab. Then he took a shovel and dug a shallow pit for a fire, ensuring it was low and wouldn't cast much light. Clara gathered pine cones and dried twigs, her movements slow and robotic. There was something surreal about it, doing these simple, domestic things with shaking hands, pretending they were just travelers out for a night's camp. But they weren't ordinary travelers, and their lives were no longer ordinary. When they sat beside the small, crackling fire that night, sharing beef jerky and hard bread, Samuel finally asked the question he hadn't before, the question that went deeper than the fire and the chase. "Why'd they do it, Clara?" he asked, his voice low. "Your folks, selling you off like that. I know they were cruel, but it don't make sense. Not even for bad people. She looked into the fire, the flames dancing in her eyes. It took her a long time to speak. My mother, she never wanted me to begin with, she began, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She always said I was too much, too loud, too heavy, too hungry. She said I was a burden from the day I was born. She paused, taking a shaky breath. My brother Clay, he was always sick, small and frail, and when he died, it broke something in her. In both of them, maybe, or maybe it just gave them an excuse. Samuel didn't interrupt. He just listened, his face a mask in the firelight. After he was gone, Clara went on, it got worse. They told me I wasn't worth the food it took to feed me, that I was too fat for any decent man to ever want, and too slow for hard farm work. So when a man came through town, a man named Avery Greaves, offering money for what he called indentured workers, they saw an opportunity, a way to get rid of me and make a profit. How much? Samuel asked quietly. The question was like a stone dropping into a deep well. She flinched, the memory of physical pain. $20, she whispered, and a bag of flour. Samuel's breath came out like a punch. He turned his head away, his jaw tight with a fury she could feel even from across the fire. I remember the day they signed the papers, Clara continued, needing to say it all now, to let the poison out. My mother braided my hair. She never did that before. She said if I looked pretty, maybe they'd let me sleep in the house instead of the barn. I didn't even know I was being sold. I thought I was finally going to a place where someone might want me. I didn't understand until I got in Greaves's wagon and he put chains on my ankles. Where'd they send you? He asked, his voice tight. A place he owned called Red Hill. It wasn't a farm, not really. It was a broken-down homestead where he and his brother ran a whiskey still out back. They didn't want farm help. They wanted a slave, someone to clean up their filth and cook their meals and keep quiet. Samuel stared into the fire, his face like carved granite. The fury simmering just beneath his calm exterior was terrifying. How'd you get away? I ran, she said simply. After 3 months, they drank themselves unconscious one night. I stole a horse and I just rode. I rode west until the horse dropped dead under me. Then I walked. I slept in fields, in barns, behind churches. I stole food when I had to. I just kept moving west until I found your ranch. Samuel looked at her then, a long, hard look. You never told me all that. I didn't think you'd want me if you knew, she whispered, shame washing over her. I thought you'd think I was dirty, used up. He scooted closer around the small fire, and for the first time, he reached for her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, strong and warm. You ain't the things they said you were, Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're strong, you're brave, and you deserve a hell of a lot better than this. She looked away, her throat closing up, so he wouldn't see the tears that were finally welling in her eyes. He didn't let go of her hand. By the 3rd day in the hidden grove, the horses were restless, and Samuel's nerves were scraped raw. They'd seen no one on the trail. They'd heard nothing in the woods but the wind and the birds. But they both knew, with a primal certainty, that the quiet wouldn't last. He spent the morning sharpening his knife on a whetstone and carefully rechecking the rifle's sight. Then he walked the perimeter of their small hideout, again and again, like a caged wolf. Clara stayed near the camp, boiling water for coffee, her own eyes constantly scanning the dense woods around them. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of blood and rust, a single distant gunshot cracked through the trees. Samuel spun toward the sound, instantly alert. Clara dropped the tin cup she was holding, its clatter loud in the sudden silence. One shot, Samuel said, his voice low and tight. South Trail. She nodded. She didn't have to ask what it meant. A signal, a warning, or worse. Either way, someone was close. They had been found. We can't stay here, Samuel said, already kicking dirt over the fire. "Where do we go?" "I got one more place," he said, his face a grim mask. "It's not much, but it's hidden. Come morning we ride again." They didn't sleep much that night. Clara lay under her thin blanket, staring up at the black, starless sky, listening to every twig snap and leaf rustle. She kept the pistol in her hand, even under the covers, its cold weight a small comfort. When she did finally drift off, it was into a fitful, terrifying dream where the fire from the barn chased her down a long, dark hallway, and her mother stood at the end of it, laughing. She woke at dawn, slick with sweat, her heart pounding. Samuel already had the wagon ready. They were just pulling back onto the faint trail when they heard it. Hooves, fast, coming from behind them. "Hold on!" Samuel yelled, and whipped the reins. The wagon jerked forward, racing down the narrow path, bouncing hard over roots and rocks. Clara clutched the rifle tight and twisted around to look back. 3 riders, dark shapes against the pale morning light. One of them she recognized, even from a distance, the slumped shoulders, the crooked nose. It was the man who had delivered the stone, the messenger. He pointed as he rode, his mouth open in a shout she couldn't hear over the thunder of their own flight. "They found us!" she cried. "Not yet," Samuel shouted back, his voice grim. "But they're trying!" They reached a fork in the trail. Samuel yanked the reins hard left, then veered off the path entirely, plunging the wagon into the thickest part of the woods. Branches whipped past them, scratching their faces and arms. The horses screamed in protest but kept running, driven by pure terror. Behind them she could hear the riders shouting, struggling to follow through the dense undergrowth. Clara ducked low, praying under her breath. They burst through a final thick thicket and came crashing into a small, forgotten clearing. An old, dilapidated cabin sat crooked in the center. Half the roof was caved in, and green moss covered the windows like a shroud. Samuel hauled back on the reins, stopping the wagon hard. "Get inside, now!" They leaped down, unhitched the terrified horses, and slapped their rumps, sending them bolting into the trees. Then they ran for the cabin. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and damp earth and decades of dust. But it was shelter. Samuel shoved a heavy, broken table against the flimsy door, while Clara frantically covered the gaping windows with rotten boards she tore from the floor. Then they waited. In the dusty, dim light, they waited, listening. They heard the riders enter the clearing, the creak of saddle leather, the jingle of harnesses. A voice, lazy and cruel, floated through the thin walls. "Well now, where'd you go, little rabbits?" Another voice, lower, meaner. "We just want the girl. Greaves wants his property back." Clara's stomach turned to ice. Greaves. He'd sent them. "Come on out, pretty thing," the first voice called, a sing-song taunt. "Your mama misses you." Samuel raised his rifle, his back pressed to the wall, his eyes locked on the straining door. Something hit the outside wall, hard. A rock. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. "We hold. We don't shoot unless they come through that door." "They'll burn us out," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "They'd have to be willing to die in the fire, too," he said. "And they ain't that brave." Minutes passed like hours. An eternity of silence stretched on. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. Samuel gestured for her to stay put. He crept to the edge of a boarded-up window, peeking through a tiny crack. He didn't move for a long, long time. When he finally turned back to her, his face was grim. "They're gone. You're sure?" "For now." That night, they stayed inside the rotting cabin. Samuel sat by the door, gun across his lap, never closing his eyes. Clara stayed near the cold, dead hearth, her fingers wrapped around a small, leather-bound Bible someone had left behind decades ago. The pages were brittle and yellowed, but she flipped through them anyway, letting the unfamiliar words steady her heart. When she looked up, she saw Samuel watching her. "You still believe in all that?" he asked softly. She nodded. I have to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver chain. At the end of it was a small, crudely hand-carved wooden cross. My mother gave me this, he said, his voice low. Back when I was a boy, I stopped wearing it after she passed, after the war. Thought maybe he wasn't listening anymore. She reached out and her fingers gently brushed against the worn wood. He's always listening, she said, even when it feels like he's not. Samuel met her eyes, a flicker of something, hope, pain, in their depths. You really believe that? I believe he led me to your ranch, she whispered. I believe he saved me when I didn't think I deserved saving. He took her hand then, his calloused thumb stroking the back of her knuckles, and for the first time, in the heart of that derelict, forgotten cabin, surrounded by danger, Clara didn't feel broken. She felt chosen. The fragile peace didn't last the night. At dawn, when Samuel cautiously opened the door, they found it. A mark had been carved deep into the wood of the door with a knife. Just one word: return. Samuel stared at it, his face hard. They're not trying to kill you, he said, his voice flat. Not yet. They want to drag you back. I'd rather die, she said, her voice shaking with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. You won't die, he promised, his eyes meeting hers. Not while I'm breathing. But Clara saw the exhaustion in his face, the fear he was trying so hard to hide, and she knew. The next time Greaves's men came, they wouldn't come with warnings or messages. They'd come with fire and rope and an evil that would not be denied. The sun rose dull and pale, a smear of gray in a colorless sky, casting the forest in a cold, metallic light. Samuel took his time packing the wagon again, checking every strap, every buckle, tightening everything twice with a grim, focused intensity. Clara helped where she could, though her fingers felt clumsy and trembled slightly. The single word carved into the cabin door still burned in her mind: return. It was more than a threat. It was a sentence, a promise of a life worse than death. They didn't speak much as they rode. The trail they followed now was little more than an old game path, winding deeper into the wild hills. But Samuel seemed to know where he was going, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. Clara trusted him, even as the trees thickened around them and the wagon rocked precariously from side to side. She kept the rifle across her knees, her finger resting near the trigger. She couldn't stop picturing them, the cruel faces of Greaves's men, the firelight catching in their eyes, the mocking drawl in their voices as they called her name like it belonged to them. Her heart beat a heavy, suffocating rhythm in her ears. Finally Samuel spoke, his voice low. There's a ridge up ahead. Below it there's a gorge. Deep, narrow. Used to be a mining site long ago. They say folks went in there and never came out. Sounds like a trap, she said, her throat dry. That's why we're going there, he replied, never taking his eyes off the path. Let them follow. Let them think we've cornered ourselves. He glanced at her then, his jaw tight with a tension that radiated off him. But we won't be the ones trapped. They reached the ridge by early afternoon. The ground simply fell away into a deep, jagged scar in the earth. Steep rock walls plunged down on either side, and a narrow, treacherous trail snaked its way toward the bottom. The wind howled low through the gorge, whistling between the rocks like a mournful ghost. Clara looked down into the abyss, her stomach churning. You've taken a wagon through there before? Not once, he said. And I ain't planning to now. She turned to him, confused. Then what's the plan? Samuel didn't answer right away. He unhitched the horses again, leading them to a sheltered spot behind a cluster of massive boulders. Then he took a long coil of thick rope from the back of the wagon and looped it over his shoulder. There's a cave, he said, pointing down into the gorge. About halfway down the wall, big enough to hide in. From the mouth of it, I can see the whole ridge clear as day. If they come, I'll know. Not if, she corrected him quietly. When? He nodded. When they come. He saw the stark fear on her face, and his expression softened for a moment. "I'm not letting them take you, Clara. You've been taken from enough." They left the wagon hidden on the ridge and made their way down the treacherous trail on foot. They hugged the rock wall, testing every footstep, the wind tearing at their clothes. The path was narrow, the drop terrifying. The air grew colder as they descended. The cave was there, just as he'd said, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of rock and gnarled roots. Inside it was dry and dark and eerily silent, but for the echo of their own ragged breathing. Samuel quickly unpacked their meager supplies: a lantern, 2 canteens of water, jerky wrapped in cloth, and a precious handful of spare bullets. Then they waited. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and blood, Clara prayed. Not for herself, but for the quiet, stubborn man who had given her more than a safe bed and 3 meals a day. He had given her back a name. He had given her back a life. Night came slow and heavy. The cave mouth gave them a perfect, clear view of the ridge above, but so far, there was no movement. Clara sat with her back against the cold stone wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. Samuel paced the small space like a caged animal. It wasn't until the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the sky that they saw it. The first dark shadow crossing the moonlit ridge. Then another. And another. 3 men. Possibly 4. Samuel dropped into a crouch by the cave entrance, his rifle steady in his hands. Clara held her breath. The men stood on the edge of the gorge, looking down, their forms silhouetted against the night sky. Then one of them raised a lantern. Its yellow beam sliced through the darkness, scanning the rock walls. It paused. It moved again. Clara's breath hitched. "They don't know where we are," Samuel whispered, his voice a ghost in the darkness. "But they know we're here." The men's voices drifted down, distorted by the wind. One of them pointed. Then, they started down the trail. "Far wall, quiet," Samuel commanded, pulling her back. They pressed themselves into the deepest, darkest corner of the cave. He handed her the pistol, his hand lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. His skin was cold. "Only shoot if you have to," he said. "Don't let them see your hands shake." "I'm not scared," Clara whispered back, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. He looked at her in the deep gloom, his eyes seeming to glow. "I am," he admitted, "but I won't let that stop me." Footsteps scraped on stone just outside the cave. A voice, lazy and cruel, floated in. "You down there, sweetheart?" Clara closed her eyes, her knuckles white on the grip of the pistol. "Best come on out before we have to come in," the voice continued, followed by a low, ugly chuckle. It was too close. The sound of crunching gravel right at the entrance. Clara counted the seconds between footfalls. 1, 2, 3. Then, in a blur of motion, Samuel stepped forward into the mouth of the cave and fired once. The shot was deafening, a crack of thunder that echoed and bounced off the gorge walls. A raw scream followed instantly. Samuel ducked back into the darkness of the cave. "One down," he hissed. Shouting erupted on the trail. Footsteps pounded, scrambling up and down the path. A return shot ricocheted off the rocks just above the cave mouth, sending a shower of stone dust raining down on them. Samuel reloaded with a calm, deadly precision that was terrifying to watch. Clara crouched beside him, the pistol held tight in her trembling hands. "We can't stay here forever," she breathed, the smell of gunpowder thick in her throat. "We won't have to." Another voice now, a different one, full of rage. "You think this ends with you 2 dead in a hole? You think she's worth dying for, rancher?" "She's worth everything!" Samuel shouted back, his voice raw and full of a conviction that stole Clara's breath. And then, without warning, a flaming object sailed through the air and landed inside the cave. A burning rag, soaked in oil. Samuel kicked it aside, but it caught on a patch of dry moss on the wall. Flames licked up the stone instantly. Smoke began to fill the small space. Clara coughed, her eyes streaming, backing away from the growing fire. "We have to go!" she cried, panic finally rising in her chest. Samuel looked from the hungry flames to the blocked entrance. "There's another way." He grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the cave, away from the light. "Where?" He didn't answer. They ran through absolute darkness, the tunnel narrowing, twisting, sloping downwards. Behind them, they could hear more gunfire, angry shouting, and the roar of the fire. Then the passage opened up again, just a narrow slit in the rock wall. And beyond it, stars. They emerged onto a narrow ledge on the far side of the gorge. They had gone straight through the mountain. A sheer drop fell away below them. Samuel moved quickly to a gnarled tree, where he'd anchored the coil of rope hours earlier, in a move of stunning foresight. He tied the end securely around Clara's waist. "You go down," he said, his voice urgent. "Fast as you can, don't look back." "What about you? I'll cover you." "No, Clara, listen to me," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "You are not going back. Not to them, not ever." She stared at him, her chest heaving, her face smudged with soot and tears. Then she nodded once. He helped her over the edge. She scrambled down, the rough rope burning her hands, her boots scraping against the stone. Every second felt like a lifetime. Halfway down, a gunshot cracked from above. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Samuel was at the edge of the cliff, returning fire, his face hard and determined in the moonlight. Another shot, closer this time. Then silence. Clara's feet finally hit the solid ground at the bottom of the gorge. She turned, fumbling with the knot at her waist, her eyes frantically searching the cliff face above. "Samuel!" No answer. "Samuel!" Then a dark shape appeared. He was sliding fast down the rope, landing in a heap beside her, his face covered in soot and blood. She threw her arms around him. He grunted in pain. "Shoulder," he gasped. "Just a graze." She helped him up and they stumbled away from the gorge wall, deeper into the cover of the woods. Behind them they could hear more shouting from the ridgetop, but it was fainter now. They had gained ground. They were alive. As they moved through the dark woods, Samuel finally spoke, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "There's a church," he said. 2 miles east. Old preacher named McDowell. He'll help us." Clara nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt and the smoke. They didn't stop walking, not even when dawn broke, not until they saw a simple white steeple rising like a promise above the trees. The church was small but solid. White paint was peeling from the walls, but the bell in the tower still hung true. Preacher McDowell opened the heavy oak door with a shotgun in his hands, his face wary. But when he saw Samuel, bleeding and leaning on Clara, he lowered it immediately. "Figured one day you'd come here bleeding, son," the old man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Wasn't planning to," Samuel managed, "but here we are." He helped them inside, into the quiet, cool sanctuary that smelled of old wood and beeswax. He gave Clara a basin of clean water and bandages. He sat Samuel down in a front pew, and, with the steady hands of a man who had seen more than his share of trouble, he stitched the wound in his shoulder. They didn't talk much, not until the worst of the bleeding had stopped. Then, in the quiet of the empty church, Clara told the preacher everything, not just about the fire or the chase, but about her parents, about the auction, about Avery Greaves, about the names they called her, about the heavy, suffocating weight she'd carried her whole life, not just on her body, but in her heart. When she was done, her voice a raw whisper in the silent hall, the preacher sat quiet for a long, long time. Then he said, "Child, you were never worthless, not to God, and not to the man sitting beside you now. You were made with care, and you were never meant to be someone else's shame." She looked down at her hands, raw and blistered from the rope. "I just want peace." "Then you'll have to fight for it," the preacher said. "But not just with guns, with the truth." He stood, walked to a small office in the back, and returned with a dusty, leather-bound ledger. Names, deeds, Papers, he said, opening it, including one I wrote myself years ago for a girl whose parents signed her away unlawfully. Clara looked up, her heart stopping. You mean? I mean, the preacher said, his eyes kind. She was never theirs to give, not legally, not in the eyes of God or the law. He tore a page from the book and handed it to her. You want peace, child, he said. Then take your name back, and make it yours for good. That night, as Samuel knelt by the simple wooden altar, his head bowed, Clara sat in the pew beside him. He didn't pray aloud, but when she reached for his hand, his fingers laced through hers, holding on tight. And together, in the sanctuary of the old church, they waited for the final battle. Because they knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. But now, they weren't running. They were standing their ground. And for the first time, Clara May wasn't afraid of the dawn. The morning was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of oppressive quiet that makes the air feel thick and heavy in your lungs. Inside the old church, Clara hadn't slept. She had paced the length of the aisle between the worn wooden pews, the paper Preacher McDowell had given her clutched in her hand like a holy relic. It was a copy of a formal complaint, filed years ago with the county magistrate and ignored. It detailed her unlawful sale, witnessed by the preacher himself. Her name, written in clean, clear ink. Legal proof. For the first time, her life felt like it truly belonged to her. But that didn't mean they were going to let her keep it. Samuel stood in the open doorway of the church, a silent sentinel watching the empty dirt road that curved around the hill. His shoulder was stiff and painful from the bullet graze, the bandage under his shirt already sticky with fresh blood. But his rifle was clean, loaded, and resting in the crook of his arm. Clara knew by the hard, determined set of his jaw that he expected company, not the kind that came to worship. Preacher McDowell had put his own old horse into the stall behind the church, saddled and ready, just in case. But none of them talked about running. Not anymore. Are we staying here? Clara asked softly, coming up to stand beside Samuel in the doorway. The morning light fell on her face, and for a moment he just looked at her, at the strength that had bloomed where fear used to live. For now, he said, his eyes never leaving the road. If they show up, they'll have to do it in the light of day, no more creeping around in the shadows. He glanced at her, a muscle working in his jaw. And no more giving you up. Clara pressed her lips together, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. What if they bring the sheriff? What if the law is with them? Then we show him what we have, Samuel said, nodding toward the paper folded in her apron pocket. And we remind him what the law is really for. She swallowed hard. Will they come today? They'll come, he said grimly. But I don't think they expect us to stand and fight. Sure enough, just after midday, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. 2 riders first, then 3, then a wagon. Clara's stomach turned to lead. Samuel raised the rifle to his shoulder, but he didn't aim. Not yet. They're making a show of it, he muttered, trying to scare us. It was working. The sight of them so bold, so confident, sent a tremor of old fear through her. But then, a new sound cut through the air. Bong, bong, bong. The church bell, loud and clear and resonant. Preacher McDowell was in the bell tower, pulling the thick rope with both hands, sounding out 3 clean peals. It wasn't a frantic alarm for danger. It was a call. For witness. For eyes. For justice. It was Sunday, and in the fields and farmhouses for miles around people heard. Farmers stopped their plowing. Women hanging out laundry paused and looked up. Children stopped their games. By the time the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the church, a small crowd of a half-dozen people had wandered into the clearing, their faces full of curiosity. The first man to climb down from the wagon was tall and thick in the chest. His coat was too fine for this dusty part of the country, his boots polished to a high shine. His dark hair was oiled and swept back from a florid face. It was Avery Greaves. the man who had handed her parents a sack of coins and dragged her into the darkness of a freight wagon like she was a piece of furniture. He sneered as he stepped forward, his eyes fixing on Clara. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and reptilian. "Ain't this a sweet picture? Our runaway flower and her pet rancher, playing house in a chapel?" Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but Samuel stepped forward, calm and slow, planting himself in Greaves's path. "She's under protection here, Avery," he said, his voice level, "and she's not your property." Greaves spat in the dirt. "Her folks signed the deal. I got the papers right here." "So do we," Samuel said, motioning toward Clara. "Signed by the man inside this church, witnessed and filed with the county, her birth certificate, her guardianship papers. It was an illegal sale. You bought nothing, and she owes you nothing." "You think that flimsy paper will hold up in court?" Greaves barked, a flash of uncertainty in his eyes. "In a town where half the judges owe me favors?" "We'll see," Samuel replied evenly. The crowd of onlookers was growing, more locals drawn by the bell. Some recognized Samuel with a nod, others recognized Clara from her trips to town, their eyes widening with understanding, and a very few recognized Avery Greaves and shifted uneasily. "You going to make a scene?" Samuel asked, his voice low. "In front of all these good folks, on the Lord's Day?" Greaves took a step forward, his face purpling with rage, and Clara saw it then, the slight twitch in his jaw, the almost imperceptible shake in his hand. He wasn't just angry. He was worried. He was afraid, because men like him didn't like the light. They didn't like crowds. They thrived in back rooms and dark alleys and shadows. "Move aside, Wyatt," he ordered. Samuel didn't move. Greaves's hand hovered over the pistol at his belt. Samuel's hand did the same. Then the church doors opened wide. Preacher McDowell stepped out, holding his heavy Bible in one hand and the letter from his ledger in the other. "This here," the preacher announced, his voice strong and carrying over the silent crowd, "is a copy of a formal complaint filed with the county seat 5 years ago. It details the illegal trafficking of a minor, one Clara May Lantry. It includes her birth records, signed by her midwife, and a statement from the undertaker who saw her parents bury a casket with no body in it, claiming their own daughter was dead from fever when she was not." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Greaves's face darkened. "I paid for her," he snapped. "You paid her criminal parents," McDowell corrected him sternly, "who had no right to sell her." He handed the letter to the nearest man in the crowd, a well-known merchant named Weller. "Read it," the preacher commanded. "Read it aloud." Weller took the paper. His voice was uncertain at first, but then it grew stronger, filled with outrage as he read. It detailed Clara's birth, her parents' neglect and abuse, the false report of her death, and the illegal sale to Avery Greaves for use in his illicit operations. Clara stood frozen as her whole secret, shameful past was aired out like a dusty rug in the bright Sunday sun. And when Weller was finished, the crowd was utterly silent. Then a woman spoke up from the back. "I knew her, Ma," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Mean as a snake. She told me once she had a daughter she was ashamed of, that she'd put her out to pasture. I never understood what she meant, not until now." Another man stepped forward, a farmer with calloused hands. "My boy worked for Greaves for a spell, said he saw him whip a girl for dropping a tray of glasses, said the girl was heavy set, said she was always crying." Clara felt herself shrinking, the old shame trying to pull her down. But then Samuel stepped to her side, wrapping his strong arm gently around her shoulders. "You don't have to hear this if you don't want to," he whispered. "I do," she whispered back. "It matters." Avery Greaves looked around wildly, his composure finally cracking, realizing the tide of public opinion was turning against him with the force of a flash flood. "You people don't know what you're doing," he growled. "She's nothing, a worthless, oversized stray. Her own parents didn't want her, and neither should any of you." Preacher McDowell's eyes narrowed to slits of cold fury. God wanted her, he said, his voice thundering, and you will not take her from his house. It happened fast. In a fit of pure desperation, Greaves reached for his gun. Samuel drew first. The shot rang out sharp and final. Greaves dropped to one knee, howling in pain, clutching his arm where the bullet had torn through flesh. His pistol clattered uselessly to the ground. People screamed, but no one ran. They had all seen it. They had all seen who drew first. The sheriff, a portly man finally roused by the bell and the commotion, rode up moments later, flanked by 2 deputies. "What in the blazes is going on here?" he began. Samuel dropped his rifle to the ground and raised his hands. "Self-defense," he said calmly. "You've got more than a dozen witnesses." McDowell pointed a trembling finger at the whimpering Avery Greaves. "That man has been buying and selling children under forged documents, Sheriff. Might want to look into that." The sheriff frowned, looking from Greaves to McDowell to Samuel. "You have proof of this?" "Written proof and spoken testimony," McDowell replied. "And as you can see, more than a dozen witnesses to how he just drew his weapon first on an unarmed woman and a man of God." The sheriff finally looked to Clara. "Ma'am, you want to press charges?" She stepped forward. For the first time in her entire life, she wasn't trembling. She looked the sheriff square in the eye. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong. The sheriff nodded. "Then we'll take him in." "You fools!" Avery shouted as the deputies hauled him to his feet. "You think this ends with me in a cell?" Samuel knelt beside him, his voice cold as ice. "No," he said. "It ends with her being free." The trial came a week later. Clara testified. So did Samuel and Preacher McDowell and Mr. Weller, and 3 other townspeople who had worked for Avery Greaves and seen his cruelty firsthand. The territorial newspaper printed her name, but not as a victim. They wrote about her as a witness, as a survivor. And when the sentence was handed down, 10 years hard labor for Avery Greaves, his entire operation dismantled, Clara stood on the courthouse steps with Samuel at her side. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and for the first time, she smiled a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. It wasn't because the verdict fixed everything, but because it proved, to the entire world and to herself, that she was not invisible. Not anymore. They didn't go back to the burned-out ranch right away. Instead, they stayed in the hills near McDowell's church. With the help of the community that had stood with them, they built a small new cabin on a ridge overlooking the valley. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but every log and every nail was theirs. Clara planted a garden. Tomatoes, potatoes, beans. She watched them grow from tiny seeds, watched the earth give back what it was given, like her life, like her name. She and Samuel didn't talk about love in big speeches or flowery words. They spoke it in the way he carried wood for the stove before she asked, in the way she made a hot stew when his shoulder ached from the cold. They spoke it in the way they read scripture together at night, one verse at a time, their heads close together in the warm glow of a single lantern. It was slow. It was quiet. It was real. One evening, with the sun setting behind the hills in a blaze of purple and gold, Samuel got down on one knee. Not because he had to, but because he wanted her to see, with no doubt in her mind, that he meant it with every fiber of his being. He held out a simple ring, a thin band of twisted silver. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that made his throat tight. "You're the bravest soul I've ever known. You made me want to be a better man." He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her heart was too full for tears. She just nodded, her soul overflowing with a joy she never knew could exist. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes." They wed in the same small church where she had stood and faced down her past. This time, she wore a clean white dress she had sewn herself. No one sneered, no one whispered. The pews were full of friends, and Preacher McDowell smiled as he said the words, "I now pronounce you man and wife." Samuel kissed her gently. There was no loud cheering, just a reverent, happy silence, as if the valley itself had paused to listen. Later that night, as they danced alone under the stars outside their new home, Clara rested her head on his chest and whispered, "I never ever thought I'd have this." Samuel kissed her temple. "You deserved it all along," he murmured into her hair. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Even after everything?" "Especially after everything," he said. And she believed him, because for the first time in her life, Clara Wyatt understood that love wasn't something that had to be earned or paid for. It was simply given, freely, wholly, forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of justice and redemption. We'll see you in the next one.